So, I'm Penelope, for those of you who haven't met me before, and I'm going to outline my research on the origins of the Alexander technique. I'm going to talk for about, probably getting on for an hour, because I want to give you the whole structure of of the new conception before we get in there and discuss it. Hi, Tessa. So yes, and this is, as some of you will know, a prelude to the 8-week course eight module course I'm going to be launching next week, which fleshes it out all much further. But here's the outline today, and I've been brewing this myself for 3 years at this point, and longing to hear how people respond to the whole story that I'm going to tell you. So if you have questions, store them, put them in the chat if you want, but we'll open it up to discussion at the end. So we all love the use of the self-account. It's a fantastic story. It's very inspiring, but how factual is it? We know facts now that weren't known even a few years ago, even to 10, 20 years ago. And in my book, which many of you will know, I gave another account of how the technique might have evolved, but there were inaccuracies in it, and I knew that even as it went to press. I knew it because I'd written the history section as one of the first sections, and then as we got closer to publication, I realized that things weren't quite as accurate as I thought, and they needed fleshing out, and they needed verifying, and so on. And I was going to do that work once the book was at the publisher. I thought, I've got a year to work on this. And that's, of course, when COVID broke, and I was straight into online teaching, and I never had a chance to correct the errors and give the evidence before the book went to print. And not surprisingly, certain people wrote critical reviews of that, which was fine. And that made me think I really got to do this research. So I started researching it in more detail, thinking it was going to be a few months' work, and it all opened up like an enormous cauliflower, as somebody once said. And so 3 years later, and I'm still working on it, but at this point, a new story has, I think, emerged. And as I say, I'm really looking forward to hearing what people think. Some of the stuff that I'm going to be presenting is based on fact. Other parts are necessarily speculative, but they are, I think, the best guess we have. So let's define the problem, the inconsistencies between the use of the self-account and the facts as we now know them. The first of which is, of course, that Alexander actually originally taught natural breathing and elocution. And this is not mentioned at all in the use of the self-account. Breathing in that account is the problem. It's not the solution. We also know he taught and studied and even taught the Delsarte system early on, because his Sydney business card around 1900 offers, along with voice and breathing work, the famous Delsarte system as applied to dramatic expression, deportment, gesture, and vocalization. And it has been suggested that Alexander developed his work out of that. And certainly at one point, Jean de Masuero thought that FM's work was Delsarte work repackaged. Well, I don't any longer think that. FM really was a genius. The more I studied his work, the more that becomes clear. And all geniuses, all creatives, I think we now know, springboard from other ideas that they put together, and out of that their own ideas emerge. So to what extent was the Delsarte work a springboard for the Alexander work, and what can we learn by investigating it and studying it? And then another conundrum, and I'd love you to put your answer to this one in the chat, if you would. How many years have you heard that it took him to develop the Alexander work? I heard 10 years. What did you hear? But we now know, you thought even more than that, Tessa. Yeah. And we now know that some people have heard 8 years, I think some people have heard 14 years. But we now know he was actually teaching within a year of his voice problems. So somehow it looked like Alexander work. There's a tale that Carrington tells of how in the 1940s, a woman turned up at Ashley Place asking for a lesson. And she was an elderly woman, and it turned out she was one of Alexander's very first students back in Auckland in 1895. And it was such a vivid experience that in London in the 1940s, 50 years later, she sought him out and went for a lesson. And she went away smiling. So it obviously, still seemed like something similar. Alexander commented afterwards to Carrington, apparently, my God, what I must have been doing with my hands back then. So what was he teaching? Was he first a breathing man and then developed the Alexander technique as two distinct techniques, which Jerome's Daring suggests? But that account of this woman would suggest something else. And I think the Carrington rather presumed that he was teaching Alexander work from the start, but calling it breathing work because that was the hot topic of the day. But is there a third possibility? That what he was doing looked like Alexander technique, but actually, in a sense, wasn't. And in a sense, that's what we're investigating here. Use of the Self, that beautiful account of the evolution of the technique, was published around the beginning of the first training course, around about in 1932. And it became the manual of the training course in a way, what you're trying to do. And it was presented as the method to follow. But I think really it's the goal. It's what Alexander could do after 30 years. That's what he was doing then. He said, you can do what I do if you do what I did. And he said we couldn't do it because we didn't concentrate, we didn't put enough work in. But what if there were multiple aspects that he didn't tell us? And there were probably very good reasons for that. He'd, moved on from things and lost interest in an aspect. There are a lot of aspects, I think, that he never clarified. And, I do sometimes wonder if there are attitude aspects he suppressed for possibly very good reasons, like he didn't want to confuse his students. So what we're looking at here, it's not just an academic investigation. We are looking to do what he actually did, because only if we investigate really what he did early on can, I think, we follow in his footsteps and discover what he actually, in a sense, was doing. He always said it's all in the books. Well, it isn't, but that's a subject for another talk. But the books were always in print in his lifetime, and he was very keen on that. But because we took use of the self at face value, that meant that when we went to read Man's Supreme Inheritance, CCC, or the early articles, we read them in the light of that first account. We're trying to interpret them from that basis, and actually they become very unreadable read like that. So I want to show you those books from another perspective. What happens if we forget use of the self for the moment and just read those early articles and early books as a starting point? And again, I think another picture emerges that gives us a ground floor experience. There's a lot of instruction in those if we know what to look for. And again, we'll be investigating that really thoroughly in my new course. So let's start at the beginning. And I think the beginning, it's been suggested by several people, the Alexander technique actually has its origins at Alexander's birth, because he was born premature, between 34 and 37 weeks, and premature babies struggle to breathe. Their lungs are not yet developed. Every breath is hard work, and it's, in a sense, a life or death struggle, every breath, because the lung membranes aren't developed, there's not enough vascularization, there's not enough air sacs, there's the membranes are too thick for gaseous exchange, the lung is going to collapse at any moment because it's no surfactant yet. There's all sorts of ways in which the prem lung is not yet ready. And so Alexander never experienced a natural breath. What prem babies do is they often grunt at the end of the out breath to stop the air sacs collapsing. That depresses the larynx. And then they then have to pull in very hard through their nostrils, which flare. They end up lifting the chest, arching the back, contracting the back, and gasping, sniffing. And this then is clavicular breathing. This then becomes their pattern. So here's our first exploration. Let's try breathing like a newborn. I'm sorry, it's not going to be very comfortable, but just have a go. Just push all the air out with a grunt, and then sniff in awfully hard through your nostrils. And that's actually why newborns are often sick, because they're so busy pulling back their head to breathe, and you can't swallow food if your head is pulled back, and then you vomit. And that again is why prem babies often die, because they can't get milk into them, because they're fighting for breath every breath. Alexander's mum, of course, was totally dedicated and fed that milk in drop by drop and helped him survive. So you're not using your diaphragm doing that, you're using clavicular breathing. And there's a woman called Jennifer Kello, some of you might have heard of, who was it still is a prenatal nurse. And she then started Alexander lessons and discovered if she thought her directions around these tiny babies, actually something changed. And they could take a normal breath for the first time, which she said always surprised them. But she then went on to train as an Alexander teacher, and she's done research talking to adults who were prem babies, and they're all still using the pattern that they developed as preterm babies, because after all, that pattern helped them survive. Why would they change it? So one could infer that that's what happened to Alexander. He was actually using very imbalanced breathing patterns right from day one. And of course, we know he had breathing attacks all through childhood, as prem babies often do, and that his health recovered round about the age of 8, and he was able to start having a more normal childhood. And that's when the prem baby lung catches up. So that also fits the story. And at that point, he did a lot of boating, swimming, riding, walking in the countryside, riding horses, training horses. And at the age of 10, he was even excused school and taught in the evenings, which meant he could spend all day at these pursuits. We'll go into FM's childhood in more detail on the new course. And anyone who joins the course will have access to Jennifer's paper, which is a bit of a treat. What did Alexander learn, one could ask, from his work with horses? And I think he wouldn't have had the strength to bully a horse into his will. So one can presume that he had to develop his own ways of natural horsemanship. His parents were both very, very skilled with horses, so he would have learned from them as well. Apparently his father could calm any horse, so he had great tutors there. And did he also then build skills in observation of movement, how to calm a troubled nervous system, how to connect, how to direct use through the will? It must have been all sorts of stuff that he learned through that work with horses. Well, at the age of 17, in 1885, he moved to Warriter to get a job in the tin mines as a clerk. And that's where he discovered acting. And he then loved it so much that in 1889, he moved to Melbourne to really focus on the theatre and more learning to be an actor. And he supported himself with clerical jobs. And I and others believe that this is actually when he probably learned the Delsarte work, or even back in Warriter, as part of his acting training. So what did he learn? Francois Delsarte, just to tell you a bit about him, he was born in 1811 and died in 1871, and he never left France. And although I thought that he could have learned from his brother Camille, who did come to Tasmania, actually the facts of that one don't fit. So I don't think, I wrote in the book that he could have learnt it from Camille's line, but I don't think that's true. What was Delsarte doing? Well, he was a gifted singer. He studied singing at the Paris Conservatoire, but the teaching was all personal idiosyncrasies. And although it was just copy me, and also although Delsart did perform for a few years, his voice gave out, and he blamed the poor teaching that he'd had, and he thought there must be a better way of teaching actors. Let's find a more systematic, scientific way. And he did masses of observations of real people making real movements in real life in response to real life situations. And from that, he developed his gestural system of training, in which he saw that people had poor habits of movement that resulted from their minds being tangled in their bodies. They were over-involved with their bodies. And he realized that to let go of poor habits, you had to let go of them from the mental point. You had to bring the mind out of the body so that the body then could be a clear channel for the nerve force to rush through, which would then balance up the muscles, free the joints, coordinate the movements, and create the clear channel for gestural expression, so that what you felt on the inside could be expressed on the outside. And he developed the first systematic way of training actors, allowing natural expression on stage, rather than the formal stagey stuff which had been happening up till then. So this was hugely successful in France from 1840 to 1860. And then in 1870, he had his very last pupil, an American called Steele MacKay, and he's the one who took it to America. And he also developed what he called harmonic gymnastics to prepare American, rather stiff bodies, as he saw, for that fluid gestural training. And Delsart apparently approved these harmonic gymnastics. He launched it in America in 1870, and it took off like a rocket. It became the dominant method of training actors for 30 years. And popular books then followed, the first of which was Genevieve Stebbins in 1885. And she appealed not just to actors, but to the general public, and particularly for women who wanted to learn deportment and grace and beautiful movement. And it became like the yoga of the day. You went to your Delsart weekly lesson. This stuff would have found its way to Melbourne. I can't yet find any concrete evidence of that. It probably came across in the books probably came in the pockets of actors who promoters were bringing in. Melbourne was a very flourishing city with a lot of different theatres. Promoters were bringing in actors from all around the world. And the Australians would have been interested in what's going on in America. Maybe they got, visiting actors to give them little workshops. They acquired books. Who knows how it happened? Probably quite organically. And we know it must have been there because Alexander studied it. So let's do the first exercise in all those Delsartian textbooks. This American strand has to have been what Alexander learnt, not the French strand. So all the Delsartian textbooks start with something they call decomposition and composition. So let's all stand up and have a go. And I'll just spotlight myself for you all. So I want you to put your arm out to the side, and we are going to withdraw the mind from the body. We're going to withdraw your will out of your fingers back to your knuckles. And the result is your fingers will just fall as if dead, so Stebbins calls it. And you can just wiggle your fingers. There's no life there anymore. Now withdraw the energy back to your wrist. Your hand now can fall as if dead. You can shake it. There's no life in it anymore. Now withdraw the energy back to your elbow. You can see this is very different from just collapsing the arm. You're withdrawing your energy from it. Again, test it. It should be, we'll do this again in a moment, so just follow along with me. Withdraw your energy back to your shoulder. And now the whole arm is just a floppy dead thing. And we've let go of the habit. Apparently, we've let go of our mental involvement with the arm. Now we're going to flow the energy back through, like water rushing back through a clear channel. And up comes the forearm. I'm just going to take it as far as the elbow to start with. This is still dead. Now I'm going to flow it through to the wrist. Now I'm going to flow it through to the knuckles and now to the fingers. Let's have another go. Just withdraw your vital force back to your knuckles. Withdraw your vital force back to your wrist. Can you feel something withdrawing? Withdraw your vital force back to your elbow. Withdraw it back to the shoulder. And now recompose it. Flow that energy back through. Alexander writes a little footnote in Use of the Self that when he talks about directing and directing the use, he not only is talking about projecting messages from the brain to the mechanisms, the muscles and so on, but also in conducting the energy necessary to the use of these mechanisms. So we are conducting the energy through to the elbow. We are directing the elbow. We're flowing some energy through to the wrist, flowing some energy through to the knuckles, and then flowing it right through to the fingertips. Now, just take that hand for a little dance around. Is it freer? Are the joints free? Is there a more coordinated movement, a more graceful movement? What do you observe? Let's just try the other arm to balance you up. Again, withdraw the energy back to the knuckles. Withdraw it back to the wrist. Withdraw it back to the elbow. Withdraw it back to the shoulder. And flow it back through again. The wrist, to the knuckles, to the fingers. If I'm going too fast for you, you do it at your own speed. Stebbins advised you to do this in front of a mirror for hours at a day. They decomposed the whole body. Their stage trick was just to fall on the floor in front of just to withdraw from the whole body into a stage fall. This is something that one can practice, and actually it makes someone very clear about whether you are letting an arm go or directing it into use. And I often use it with new pupils in this way. Withdraw it so they let me have their arm, and now can they send some energy through and let the arm be free. So actually this is useful stuff. So and we'll be investigating more of the Delsart work in the new course, because and we'll also be comparing the Delsartian exercises with Alexander exercises, procedures, and see what the similarities are and also what the differences are. Did he develop it from that? Did he not? And we'll be able to make up minds for ourselves. So I think that Alexander had a good foundation in Delsart before his voice problems ever happened, because it would have given him this knowledge that all poor habits have their roots in the mind. You need to let go of these to allow something different, which can feel wrong. Some of the Delsartians talk about what one could now call faulty sensory perception. I think it also gives very, very good body mapping, a real awareness of where your joints are and in what planes they move and how the hand moves and so on. And then how to convey meaning and emotion with those. Delsart includes oppositions and an early form of procedures, such as coming on toes, which actually involves what Alexander would then call antagonistic action. And the Delsart work involves sitting and standing, taking a step, walking, all using harmonic poise, as the Delsartians called it, which Alexander would later name mechanical advantage. So there's a lot of stuff in there with parallels. Alexander got very good at his acting and he started winning competitions, and that's when he decided to go for it, turn professional, and he upped his training, he intensified what he was doing, and that's when his voice gave out. Because his poor health had continued with breathing attacks, lowered vitality. His little biography describes that, how he'd had sympathetic bosses who'd let him take work home. And then he'd had a more serious attack, which his doctor had said, you've got to go to the seaside for 3 months and recuperate, because Melbourne, like all cities of the time, was polluted. And the major killers in that day wasn't heart disease and cancer, it was TB, tuberculosis, and bronchitis. The lungs were the vulnerable point. When he came back from the seaside, he went to live with his voice coach, Fred Hill. And his father had been T.E. Hill, the famous orator, and they would almost certainly, the Hills would almost certainly have had a good library of books. So young FM probably turned to books for solutions for things in those days. Apparently, AR said he always had his nose in a book. And so when he had his voice problems, he was in the right place, possibly with the right library. And he discovered the 3 books that he mentioned in the first articles were probably on Fred Hill's shelves, and they were Hartley, Brown and Benke, and Koffler, which all gave systematic ways of how to breathe with the voice based on science and anatomy, not just hand down ad hoc ideas. And all those 3 books agree that if you have voice problems, you don't start the potential research area. Maybe the timing matches the timing of Delsart work in Melbourne. Yes. Thank you. Very nice. Yes, good point. So all those 3 authors agree that if you have voice problems, you cannot start with the voice. Where you have to start is sorting your breathing out, because most people are breathing clavicularly. And FM would have realized that really applied to him. So this is what he explains he's teaching in the first articles. It's where he started, coming out of clavicular breathing, first to the abdominal breathing, and then full chest breathing. But how did he do something different? Because most authors focus the in-breath, and he writes this, most authors focus the in-breath, I focus the out-breath. Now, Koffler and Brown and Benke all discover the importance of the out-breath, but they don't use it as FM does. That aphorism has come down to us. If I don't breathe, I breathe. If you want to tell somebody how to breathe, tell him not to breathe. So and years later, in fact, he would tell Frank Pierce Jones of how he learnt to use his hands in a different way in teaching by applying the inhibitory control, which had proved so effective in breathing and speaking. So it would seem that his unique method was inhibition, waiting at the end of the out-breath, inhibiting the natural in-breath, so that the body's organizational systems take over and organize a spontaneous and natural full breath. And he writes, in 1906, he writes, I do not claim to have discovered any new method of breathing, but to understand the only true one, nature's. So let's all explore this undoing, not doing, which was the cornerstone of his method. If you'd all like to lie down, we'll have a go at this for ourselves. So if you can all find yourselves a nice space on the floor and lie down. Now, I've looked at authors of the day, trying to find authors who used a similar method. And I have found 2, but they're both too late to have been Alexander's original method, because he had to have been doing this in maybe 1893. And I found somebody who wrote about it in 1895, and somebody else who's Emily Bishop, who's one of the Delsartians, and another one who, Benke's daughter, actually wrote about it in 1926. So whether this method was around, or whether he really did find it for himself, who knows? But of course, even these other authors, they used this inhibition to find the in-breath, but then they went back to more active methods, whereas Alexander stayed with undoing as the primary of his method. So let's put one hand on the chest and one hand on the belly, and I want you to start off by going back to that horrible old clavicular breathing. Oh, I've forgotten to get a book over my head, never mind. So just do that, pulling in with the upper chest and being aware the abdomen really isn't doing anything if you do that. In fact, the head will want to pull back, and you might notice neither is your diaphragm doing anything, neither really is your rib cage. It's all happening up here. So let's just think about not breathing, just waiting at the bottom of the out-breath, just letting that out-breath happen and just wait and wait and wait. And the wonderful thing about breathing to work with inhibition is that it does look after itself. At some point, the in-breath will just come in and will organize itself. And we could also use that decomposition that we've just been using. Let's withdraw the energy from the clavicles, from the chest. Just take the energy out of it. And wait. See what happens when we breathe in. And again, just withdraw that energy from the rib cage, from the tummy. And let the in-breath happen. And again, just withdraw the energy. Withdraw the energy out of the belly, out of the back. Just wait. You observe that you then get a quieter in-breath, a fuller in-breath, in which the diaphragm comes into play, the rib cage comes into play, the correct abdominal muscles come into play. To me, one of Alexander's main discovery, I think, is that if we get out of the way, there are natural organizing mechanisms in the body. We just need to get this conscious mind out of the way. So we're withdrawing the conscious mind from the body, decomposing it, if you will, and then letting the breath recompose it. Every muscle is actually coming into play correctly, just waiting and waiting and waiting at the bottom of the out-breath, waiting a bit longer than you expect, taking your energy out of the body, and then let the breath come in. Okay. So I trust that's long enough for you to have given yourself a new experience. What must that first natural breath have felt like to FM? He told Trevelyan many years later, a man hasn't lived till he can widen the back. He didn't say a man cannot live until he's freed his neck. He said until he can widen the back. So again, we'll be exploring Alexander's full method in the new course, because this is only the first part of it, of discovering what he called the thoracic mechanism, the natural movements of the thorax, but then not just organize the breathing, but actually go ahead and organize the whole body. I don't believe that, because, so to say, the thoracic mechanism, he then said, led to primary movement. And again, people who've read these early articles from the basis of use of the self thought that primary movement was that little movement of the head forwards and up on the neck. But I don't believe primary movement is this, because in his early articles, he takes the head up, because if you pull your head back, you can't sing and speak freely. So this instruction actually is in all the breathing instructions, all the singing instructions, all the oratory instructions. It's in Brown and Benke, it's in everybody. And it's not the element he italicizes. It's not the element he puts first. It's way down the list. And it's not where his focus is. It's just oh yes, and you have to do this too. The part he italicizes are to do with this torso mechanism. He's not interested in the head at this point. He's interested in the torso. That's what comes across. And in these articles, he describes poor breathing as the cause of all posture and health problems. He sees breathing as primary. And indeed, given his history as premature birth, breathing was indeed the source of his problems. So that makes sense. So where does the use of the self-account fit? Well, Jean Fischer has pointed out that in use of the self, it's the discovery of how to prevent the pulling back of his head, which decreases the hoarseness and allowed his larynx and vocal cords to improve. The discovery that the head comes forward and up actually comes much later, and he doesn't define primary control until 1925. So I think this initial discovery of pulling back the head, and if you free it, everything frees off, could have been made through this breathing work, enough to mend his voice to act again and then begin working with others. But no doubt, as he began to work more on himself, and as he gained experience of bringing pupils out of their breathing problems, he must have started to see increasingly the importance of that relationship of the head to the neck to the back. And so slowly his idea about the head neck back relationship evolved so that he was able to write about it when he got to Man's Supreme Inheritance. And of course, later, after constructive conscious control was written, that's when primary control got defined. Breathing and voice were hot topics of the day, not only because of the fact that it was the main killer of the day, but also, I think, because voice problems also were a major issue. The population had grown so much. If you think in Britain about the difference between a small, beautiful 18th century church and the huge Victorian 19th century churches, and there were still no PA systems. And presumably the same thing was happening in Australia. The lawyers, the public speakers, the vicars, they were all having to speak into these vast spaces to large groups of people, and they were straining their voices. So Alexander's first lessons that he gave were for actors and voice. And I believe that in those early lessons, he was teaching people to breathe. But as part of that, he had to get their bodies into awareness and life to free off the thoracic mechanism. So I speculate that he started to do bits of Delsarte with them, coming on toes, standing in balance, taking a step. And other authors talk about leaning with your hands on the back of a chair to open the back. That's in some of the singing instructors. He'd already got his observation skills through working with horses, and possibly skills of directing the horses through his voice and intention. He had a sense of his own body through the Delsarte work, giving a sense of where his body was and what it's doing. But one can presume that most of his pupils did not have this background, so they struggled to do what he was able to do quite easily. And that's why he began to use his hands instinctively. You know, they didn't know where their necks were or where head forward and up is. So he took their heads up. That's what what Marjorie Barlow tells us. And then perhaps he was drawn to manipulate their arms to free off their rib cage. And so the Alexander work started to develop. He started to get that facility with the hands. So was he using Delsartean exercises as his early procedures and turning them gently into his own procedures? The various voice teachers, Brown and Benke and so on, they do give physical games to play, but one doesn't sense the same similarity, the same parallels with Alexander work, while the parallels in the Delsartean authors are often very clear. It's also been suggested he might have drawn on other physical therapists around at the time. People have looked at the work of the Roths, who were straightening spines. But again, if one reads that, it's terribly harsh. I don't think Alexander would have been drawn to that. Whereas the Delsartean stuff is subtle, it's beautiful, it fits much better. Through those early articles, between 1894, particularly in 1903, one has the sense of this young man, Alexander, finding his own voice and making the technique his own. In 1903, he gets the idea to write his own book, which would have been a bit of a like the Delsarte, a bit of a sort of cookbook, a self-help. This is how you breathe. This is how you move. That book never got written, but you can feel him beginning to find his own confidence. And then he moved to London in 1904, still teaching breathing and voice work. And there are several detailed articles that he writes describing his work. He became friends with Dr. Spicer, who was, of course, the major sort of throat and nose man of the day, a breathing man. And he obviously gained a lot from Dr. Spicer, and Dr. Spicer gained a lot from him. But then in 1908 to 1909, several things happened together. He began to suspect that Dr. Spicer was trying to steal his methods. And this could have been disastrous for him. And one knows of scientists who were unknown, whose work got stolen by famous scientists, and the unknown person was just out. That could so easily have happened to Alexander as an uneducated unknown from the provinces, from the colonies, versus an established doctor, a leader in the field. So he split with Spicer. And it is at this time, is it coincidence? Is it not? It's at this time that he changes his focus from breathing being causative of all health and postural problems to posture, use of the body, use of the whole body, as causative of all breathing and health problems. Of course, being FM, he's not shy of making enormous claims. Good old FM. And he writes an article in 1908, Re-Education of the Kinesthetic Systems. And I think this is where the Alexander technique really begins, 14 years after its beginning in Tasmania. And Man's Supreme Inheritance, the first book, was published 2 years after that. And in 1911, he talks about the head going forward and up, and the Alexander work, as we know it, has begun. So these are my answers to our original conundrums. And for those of you who want to explore this further, in our new course, we'll take it much further. So let's open up the discussion. What do you think? Did you like the experiments? So would anyone like to comment? And Sue.
I think it's fascinating, Penelope, and thank you for sharing that with us. I found recently in teaching that sometimes I go to the head and it just doesn't, feel right, and I always end up on the torso. So what you're saying to me is it makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Yes, and of course, when I worked with Miss Goldie, I was struck at the time that she worked far more with my torso and less with the head. So I think this is a development that happened. Yeah. Tessa.
It ties in quite a lot. Thank you, Penny, by the way, it's fascinating. It makes me think of some of the work you do a lot with mind in the brain and the withdrawal of, I like the will, and then the feeding of the energy.
Yes. Yes. And could you feel that it changed the whole balance of the arm doing that? Yes, lovely. Did anyone else have feedback on that particular exploration? Because it's a slightly strange exploration, but it's quite clear in its intention of what it's doing, I think.
I've had a problem with my left shoulder, and I noticed while I was able to do the exercise well on my right side, my left one was hanging up. It was I still have some issues in the shoulder, I think, to work out.
Yes, and Stebbins would say, do it again and again and again, and see if it balances it out. And that's how they were working. And also, they weren't just working. She also suggests working into a mirror, project your directions. That may be where the phrase project your directions come from, which is where this separation of the of the thinking of the act with the doing of the act, which is another thing Alexander really stresses.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Malcolm, I'm longing to hear what you think.
Hello, morning. Brilliant, thank you. That was really, really interesting. Great, great work. Yes, this withdrawing of energy, I was interested in that. Decomposing, she calls it, doesn't she?
Oh.
So it's relaxing, I think, is the word we'd use rather than the French. And I use that idea when I'm taking a shoulder with somebody lying on the table. If you've got a hand underneath the shoulder, I think of withdrawing my energy as I pull my elbow back to slide the hand out. And it comes out very smoothly. You don't get stuck underneath the shoulder, and they're left with a nice feeling of the direction. So I do use that in my teaching, that idea.
Wow, I hadn't tried it that way. That's nice. I've been teaching it to the pupil rather than using it myself. Let's try that. Thank you. Yes. Kieran.
Hi. Yeah, I found that exercise interesting. It kind of played into something I've been playing with for a while, around like noticing where in my body I seem to be. So where I kind of identify with most in my body. And it was interesting playing with my right arm, because I get the sense for a while I kind of live a lot in this corner of my body. And so withdrawing took some time, especially in the upper part of the arm compared to the lower. I was curious as well, when you do the withdrawing, is there somewhere that you withdraw it to?
Ah, that's a good question. Stebbins specifies that you withdraw it to the reservoir at the base of the brain, which I think is an interesting one, because you're withdrawing it to the brainstem. And of course, the brainstem, we now know, is where the primary organization, the self-organization and movement takes place. So yeah, I have played with withdrawing it to the base of the brain. It's interesting. Malcolm.
Yeah,
Go on, Kieran, first. Go on.
I was just going to say, when we were doing it with the limbs, I just kind of retracted it inward centrally. But when we started doing it with the torso, I was like, oh, okay, well, where am I going to put it? And I played with sort of putting it into the ground, which was, one thing, and putting it above my body, lying down, which is another thing. But yeah, I'm curious to try the brainstem now.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. And Miss Goldie used to say to me, take my mind to the top of my head. Missy Vineyard says, take it to the front of the head. Goldie took it to the top of the head, and Peter Grundville, the eye body man, takes it to the back of the head, to the visual cortex. So that's three other options. But say Stebbins takes it to the base of the brain. So play around and see which one feels useful to you. Malcolm.
I think the answer is who knows, but Stebbins and all around that time, they had this idea of nerve force or life force, the life force. And Stebbins talks about having a reservoir of this life force, which flows out and is drawn back into this reservoir. And I've just played around with that idea. But as you say, it could be the base of the neck, the base of the brain. It could be somewhere, your heart,
And it could also be the dantian. In
yes.
the East, they talk about that reservoir being in the dantian, below the belly button.
Yeah.
So, I think there's probably a number of answers. But, I think nowadays we go, ooh, energy, nerve force. But actually, you can feel it. You can feel that energy current going through and being withdrawn. So, I think let's not be too scientific about this one, but go with experience. Anyone want to talk about, anyone else want to comment on that one? Hello, Roger, by the way. Good to see you. You're muted.
done. Yeah. I was just apologizing for late coming in. Really upset I am now, because it's been fascinating, just the bit I've got.
Thank
Lovely.
you.
Love the presentation.
Thank you. How do people find that breathing exercise, that again, just waiting at the bottom of the out breath and allowing the reorganization of the torso that then comes about? Would anyone like to comment on that one? This is one you might well have done before, but in different ways.
I would say potentially, as someone who it's new to, it's quite scary waiting for the at the bottom of the out breath. Will the in breath ever come, etc. And so it takes moments to kind of get through that. And but then, as you say, it does seem to kind of happen all by itself at some moment, even if one is still sending the kind of thought message not to do anything. It kind of then just does happen, even though you're still saying, don't do anything, don't do anything. So yeah, it's a curious experience.
It is when we first, yes. I mean, Jennifer Keller, she says when she did this with the premature babies, when they first experienced a natural breath, this total look of surprise would come on their faces. What just happened? Yes, but it's so easeful, isn't it? It's weird, but it's also such a relief, so nice, I think. Certainly was for me when I first had natural breath. Tessa?
Yeah, the longer I go, the more I realize that the primary to our work is breathing. So it's really wonderful to hear the whole history and realize that it's the primary puzzle piece.
Yes.
And yeah, I like the way you used, obviously, the word waiting, because I think in a lot of breathing practices, it's like hold the breath, like exhale, hold, having, I taught yoga for many years. And I think it doesn't allow one to explore the natural.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I like, I mean, Alexander's a genius with this.
Yes, it's just magic stuff. But and I think that's why he did, because later on he went to, that whole exploration that he does in Use of the Self of, I'm going to talk, no, I'll lift my hand, no, I'll just wait, which then allowed him, when he completely stepped out of the way, then to allow his vocal mechanism to come into play in a different way, so that he discovered how to speak without interfering with his own mechanism. But that's quite a hard one to do first. And I think the beauty of starting with breathing is that, as Kevin said, you wait and wait and wait and wait and wait and wait and wait. And the body will not just wait forever. It will at some point do it for you. And so you can experience what it is to get out of your own way. And then if you then do that experiment of, well, I'm still got this habit of pulling my head back when I speak, I presume, I don't know, I can't really work out at which point he did that experiment. And I've no doubt he did, presumably fairly early on. But to me, it makes sense that it's after this initial breathing exploration where he knows that if he waits, somehow he can allow something different to happen. Anyone like to comment on that? Malcolm?
In bel canto technique, they call it the exquisite moment. And you breathe out and you have to, it's scary, but it's kind of like a Halloween scary. It's sort of, oh, when's it going to happen? And you've got to have that optimistic, looking forward to the moment that the breathing does itself. I suppose ultimately there will be one day when it doesn't happen and we'll move on in our journey, but hopefully it always does. It will never disappoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So, and that's interesting what you just said, because I've looked for that written down and I've not found it. So I'd love that reference, please, Malcolm, because one does, I've also assumed that it is somehow around with singers, that somehow if you just wait, the breath will do itself and you'll organize it. So yeah, I mean, these ideas were around. What Alexander did was pick them up and ran with them. Much more And also, you know, I have encountered singers who knew how to do that, but again, it was more of a holding rather than a total release that then really allowed that full engagement of the torso. Yeah. Anyone else want to comment? Roger.
Yeah, I was just picking up from what Malcolm was saying there. It's just it just underlines the kind of inherent well-being of the body. It's actually functioning in our interest, and it's only in a way us getting in the way that interferes with that. I think that's the basis of the technique, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And there it is right at the beginning with breathing.
And yeah, it's very clear in the breathing as an example of that.
Yes, yes. And he then discovered how to put it into all these other contexts. And that was, again, his amazing discovery.
But just as simply just knowing that, just understanding that sort of, as a sort of a principle, there is that inherent well-being underneath it all.
Yes.
Otherwise we're having to work all the time to sort of maintain life.
And again, I think the Delsartians discovered that. I mean, there's some of the quotes of there's a lovely piece Stebbins wrote for the newspaper, and you know, you read it and you go, you're discovering poise, you're discovering freedom of the joints, you're discovering freedom of movement, you're getting out of your own way. They really read like Alexander.
Oh, lovely.
But so I think yes, that was there, but what Gianno Masuera commented, because he was the one who put me onto this stuff. He's a French teacher, for those who don't know. And he commented that he thought that Alexander was the one who more fully understood Delsart than anyone else, because so many of them, it deteriorated into, well, this is how you free the joints, and this is how you balance the body. Whereas he really understood the mental side of it and took that way further. Thank you. Now, I just saw an interesting comment in the chat. Victoria, thank you, Penelope. Very interesting as always. I stayed for long in lying down position and watched my breathing. It took time that natural breathing could stay with me without the force, faster breath rushing in, and I had to let go that energy force again and again. Absolutely. This is something we just have to, because we're so wanting to get on, as it were, we just have to wait and wait. And the more we can do that, the more things will just find their own way back into balance. Kieran asks, how long is too long to wait? At what point am I working too hard at not to do the breathing in? Well, when I was first doing this, I found it very hard not to hold because my belly muscles were so tight that if I had my hand on my belly, I would feel it sort of stiffen after a while. And I think one is just relaxing into that, seeing if I can not let that happen. When one starts working too hard at it, then that tension comes back in. And again, if I wait too long, I might then do a gasp. So that's another indicator. We want to wait long enough that we can really relax into it, but not so long that we come up like we've been underwater for 20 minutes. Does that make sense, Kieran? Does that answer your question? And I think it's something, again, if you work at this, if we just keep working at it, it becomes clearer with time. We are, again, paying attention to it, but yet getting out of our own way so that we really can just let that breath engage. And the more our sympathetic nervous system is still a little bit on edge, the more we'll want to get back into the in-breath, because the sympathetic is what controls the in-breath. The more we can just release into it, relax into it, we come into the parasympathetic, and then the body organizes it for itself. So it's a process. It's a balance between the two. Does that make sense? Jane.
Hi, Penelope. I was interested in what you seem to be talking about, a shift in Alexander from early focus on breathing as underlying everything, and then moving towards posture underlying everything? And what's your sense of why he made that shift? I'm wondering whether it's about distinguishing himself from other people or noticing that people get in trouble when they focus on the breathing. Because you said really early on about him sort of leaving things out of books, de-emphasizing certain aspects of the work.
Yes, so I think the simple answer is we don't know. All one can find is the clues. And it may be that, as you say, he became increasingly aware that if he asked people to focus on their breathing, they interfered with it. It's interesting that the first piece he writes is about the faulty kinesthetic systems, that people don't really know what they're doing, which rather suggests that he's getting frustrated with pupils being given an instruction and then working too hard at it because they can't feel what they're doing. So it may well be that that's part of it. He actually writes that something along the lines of, I can't remember it precisely, but it's something along the lines of, if you take a person who breathes well and a person who breathes badly, if you alter the use of the person who's breathing badly, they will then breathe as well as the person who breathes well and has good use. So he then says that breathing is not primary, it's not even secondary, it's tertiary. Primary is our consciousness, the secondary is how we're using our body, and the breathing then comes out of that. And that then becomes how he teaches. And so that the early breathing instruction, which is actually so precise and so wonderful, is then lost. But so I find it frustrating. There's suddenly this shift. And you say, where's the breathing gone? Just where's it gone? And yet it is still there. It is primary to our work if you know to look for it. But I went through my training course without hearing about breathing. I mean, occasionally people would sort of do something, but there was no mention of it really. And I think a lot of people had that experience, including Jessica Wolf, which is why she then went to Carl Stow. Yeah. But this thing also about Spicer, because it does seem strange to me that he developed this amazing thoracic mechanism. He had precise ways of instructing the pupil to bring that about. And he stopped giving that instruction in subsequent, like in CCC, where he gives, constructive conscious control, the book where he gives a long explanation of breathing and also hands on back of chair. And he tells the pupil instructs them how to use their primary control, as it were, to free their neck, let their head go forward and up. He tells them directions to think to the primary organization. And then he says, well, the teacher with his hands adjusts the thoracic mechanism. He stopped giving the instructions of how to bring about that thoracic mechanism for yourself. And it's never mentioned again. So that makes me wonder whether he decided just to keep the lid on that one. And I don't know. Maybe he just thought it would confuse people, and that's why he didn't mention it again. But I actually had voice problems a couple of years ago because my grandchildren were born, and my God, little kids bring in vicious bugs. And I had some awful colds, and I was coughing for months and months, and my voice got very harsh and very coarse and croaky and weak. And when I follow Alexander's instructions that he writes in those early articles, it mends my voice. And then I forget to do it, and the voice goes croaky again, and I go back to doing what he says. These are instructions that really work. Why did he stop teaching them? So who else would like to? Malcolm, do you have any comment on this one? Oh, Helen, good to hear from you.
I wonder whether he was, once he'd said it in one book, he didn't feel the need to elaborate any further because he'd already said it, and he went on to other things, and he was dealing with the individual and each individual as they came when in his teaching. And he also maybe didn't want to be too prescriptive, and wanted people to explore for themselves a bit more, take on responsibility.
Yes,
I don't know.
I think all that is true, but it's very interesting, the instruction he's prepared to give, and the instructions he pares it down just to those primary directions, and they're the only ones then in the books. And yet, I mean, there's antagonistic action that he writes about that he talks about in the Bedford Lecture. That's not in any of his books. So there's a number of things he's teaching that actually don't make it into the books. But those early articles disappeared. It's intriguing, isn't it? And we don't know. And it may just be because he moved on. Malcolm.
I agree. You wonder why, because he talks about antagonistic action in Man's Supreme Inheritance in a little extra bit that's missed out of everything else. And yet antagonistic action, as you say, is something that's crucial, central to the whole approach. Remember that he made his living in Sydney, being the breathing man. He had his friend, was it Mackay, Dr. Mackay, who said, I'll make you or break you. And he managed to convince Mackay that he got something special. And they worked together for that 4 years. And then there was a book came out by Harry Campbell in 1898 that Mackay, whatever his name was, Mackay, wasn't it? Read. And there's something in there that is very similar to the kind of thing that Alexander was talking about, widening the back. And it's Mackay that says, look, you've got something here. You need to go to London to let these people know about it. So that's his reason. That's why he said he went to London. And then he met Spicer, and Spicer, being a little bit like medics can be, he said, "This, what you've got is far too important to trust just to a layman. The medics need to take over." And of course they distorted it, so he distorted it so much into kind of exercises and treatment that Alexander wrote that objection, didn't he? He was
absolutely
not going to have any of it.
Yes. Did Spicer actually say that then?
Sorry?
Did Spicer actually say that? Once you've got
Yes,
it?
if you read if you read Alexander's objection,
yes, it's in there.
He says that's why he got so angry with Spicer, because he thought it was something that laymen couldn't be trusted with, that the medics had to take over.
That's right. Thank you. Roger.
Yeah, I just kind of saying much the same as Malcolm just then. I mean, initially he was known as the breathing man, but I think he saw the work as being much wider. He didn't want to be defined in that sort of narrow way. Especially if you look at Man's Supreme Inheritance, he saw the work as being so much wider, and to be known as the breathing man would have been seen to be in quite a narrow field. I think.
Nice.
That's why he would move away from that.
Yeah, that's a very nice point, actually. Thank you. So, come join my course. You know, we're going to investigate this in more detail. We're going to do a lot more, a lot more breathing games out of those early books. A lot more Del Stark games. Really, to me, they're very valuable in understanding the roots of what he was really trying to get us to do with our torsos when breathing, and how that then supports the voice. We'll play a game where we can then be a mayor of the town welcoming 1 million people. And we're going to do a lot more Delsartian stuff on oppositions and antagonistic action. And I think, again, it can really give us things. What time are the Zoom sessions? They're on Wednesdays, and they're at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, UK time. which is perhaps not the most accessible time, but I'm hoping enough people can do them and actually come live. And all sessions will be recorded, so people can, if needed, just come in for a part of a session, or can get in some weeks but not other weeks, and follow on the recordings otherwise. And as I say, it's 4 weeks before Christmas, 4 weeks after Christmas. We'll take a break over Christmas. Kieran says, interesting that breathing seems to have been primary to postural organisation, and yet he moved away from it. Maybe it makes me wonder if it was because it was his primary interference and the fundamental interruption to his own natural use and breathing, and therefore critical to his own practice. But when he had enough experience working with others, they had different and possibly varied primary interferences that responded better, at least on balance, to coming at things from a postural perspective. I think that's very, very true. I think that's beautifully put, Kieran. Thank you. Yes, so back to talking about this course. So, as I say, I do hope that some of you will join us. And again, it'll be very exploratory, and we'll be looking at pictures that are actually in the Delsartean books, and really being able to make up our own minds and comparing how things go. More questions on that. And there's an early bird offer on at the moment, which was on until Tuesday night, and then it went off again, and I've put it back on for this weekend. So if you book before midnight on Sunday, you can get the discount rate again. So yes, any more questions of any variety? And I'll send you all information out afterwards, and everybody will get the recording also. Yes, so any more questions or comments? It's been really great to share this with everybody. Thank you for turning out on a Saturday morning or Saturday evening for our Antipodean friends. And nice that some of you could make it. Okay, right. Well, for once in my life, it looks like I'm going to keep to time. So, yes, thank you all. Thank you for coming, and hope to see you all again soon, one way or another. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Penelope.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Seeing you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Penelope. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Really cool.
Thank you.
Could I have a word with you, Penny? Is it okay, or do you need to go?
Absolutely. That's
Thank
fine.